I want to say something about authority before I tell this story, because authority is what the story is really about, and because I have spent 31 years thinking about it in ways that most people do not have occasion to think about it. Authority is not volume. Authority is not posture. Authority is not the confidence of someone who has never been told no in a meaningful way and has therefore concluded that no is not a word that applies to them. Real authority is quiet. Real authority does not announce itself in the middle of a swimming pool. Real authority is a piece of paper and a number on a door and 23,000 residents whose safety is your professional and legal responsibility, and it does not need to raise its voice because it does not need to. I know this because real authority is what I carry, and I have carried it for a long time, and the specific experience of watching someone mistake loudness and entitlement for the real thing is one I have had on many occasions and have never entirely gotten used to. My name is Douglas Hale. I am 59 years old. I am the Sheriff of Pershing County, Virginia, a position I have held for 11 years through 3 consecutive elections, having served 17 years before that as a deputy and detective with the same department. I grew up in Pershing County, went to school here, raised my children here, buried my parents here, and will retire here when the time comes, which is not yet. I know this county the way you know a place when it is not just where you live, but what you are made of, its roads and hollows and the families in them, the history of the land and the people, the particular quality of the light in October when the hardwoods turn and the Blue Ridge is visible on the clear days. I have driven this county's roads at 3 in the morning in every weather it produces, and I know them the way I know my own driveway, which is the only way a sheriff should know his county. I live in Ridgetop Commons, which is a 52-home HOA development on the northwestern edge of Pershing County. I have lived there 8 years. I moved in after my divorce. The house I had lived in for 22 years was sold. We split it fairly, and I bought a place that was smaller and newer and required less maintenance and had a pool, which was something I had always wanted and which I now had the time to enjoy given that the house was mine alone and my schedule was my own outside the considerable demands of the office. I swim every morning when the pool season allows, May through October usually, depending on the year. The morning swim is the best part of most days. It is 30 minutes in which I am not the sheriff, not anyone's supervisor, not the person who gets called at 2 in the morning about a situation that requires the sheriff's presence. I am a man in water, counting laps, and the water does not care who I am or what my title is, and I find that genuinely restoring. I should be clear about something. The pool at Ridgetop Commons is the development's community pool. This is not a private backyard pool. It is the shared amenity maintained by the HOA, available to all residents and their guests during posted hours. I am a resident. I pay dues. The pool is available to me during posted hours under exactly the same terms as every other resident. I have used it 3 or 4 mornings a week for 8 years without incident or complication. Because I arrive early, I swim my laps, I leave, and the shared amenity functions exactly as shared amenities are supposed to function when people use them within the rules that govern them. The Colton family moved into Ridgetop Commons approximately 3 years ago. Diane Colton was a woman in her early 50s who had come from a larger house in a wealthier zip code and who had arrived in Ridgetop Commons with the specific adjustment difficulty of someone who had downgraded by choice and was not entirely at peace with the choice. She was not unpleasant as a rule. She attended HOA meetings and was active in the social committee and brought things to neighborhood gatherings that were well received. What she was, as I observed over 3 years, was a woman who had one significant blind spot, and that blind spot was her son. His name was Trent. He was 23 years old. He had graduated, or not graduated, the neighborhood accounts varied, from a private university somewhere in North Carolina, and had come home to his mother's house in Ridgetop Commons after this academic outcome, which had been followed by approximately 2 years of what I observed as fairly confident unemployment. Trent drove a late-model BMW that Diane had apparently purchased for him. Trent was at the pool frequently in the summer because the pool was something to do, and Trent appeared to have substantial unstructured time. He had the physical presentation of a young man who had spent some years being told he was exceptional and had not encountered sufficient countervailing evidence to revise this assessment. I had interacted with Trent exactly twice before the day in question. Both interactions had been brief and unremarkable, the kind of exchanges you have at a shared community amenity where you make minimal conversation and coexist without difficulty. He was not rude in those encounters. He was the variety of young man who is too preoccupied with his own presence to be reliably rude or reliably polite. He simply existed in the pool area with the assumption that his existence there was the natural center of any given situation. The day in question was a Thursday morning in late June. I had arrived at the pool at 6:45, as I usually did, before anyone else was there. The pool hours started at 6 in the morning for residents. I had my lane ropes set on my usual side, the left lane, which I had used for years on early mornings when no one else was there, and which I used with the reasonable expectation that if other swimmers arrived, they would use the other lane, and we would coexist without difficulty, as swimmers at shared pools do. I was 12 laps into my 30-lap routine when Trent arrived. He arrived at approximately 7:15, which was later than I usually saw anyone at the early hours, but earlier than the weekend crowd arrived. He had a girl with him, a young woman I had not seen before, also in her early 20s, carrying towels and a small bag with the specific quality of someone who had been brought to a place by someone else and was navigating the social dynamics of that arrangement. Trent walked in with the poolside confidence of a person on home territory. He scanned the pool. He saw me in the left lane. He stood at the pool's edge for a moment. I was mid-lap, wall to wall, counting. And I was aware of him at the edge of my peripheral vision in the way that you are aware of things at the edge of your peripheral vision when you are doing something physical that requires attention, but not all of your attention. I completed the lap and touched the wall and pushed off for the return. When I came back to the near wall and stopped to breathe between laps, Trent was crouched at the pool edge near my lane. He said, "Hey, you're in my lane." I looked at him. I was in the water, which meant I was looking up. I said, "Good morning." He said, "That's my lane. I use that lane every morning." I said, "This is the community pool. The lanes are available to all residents on a first-come basis." He said, "I've been using this lane all summer and everyone knows it's mine." I said, "Lane reservations aren't a feature of the community pool." He said, "Look, man, I'm telling you I use that lane. You're going to need to move." I want to describe what I felt in that moment accurately. What I felt was not anger. It was the specific variety of patience that comes from 31 years of dealing with people who mistake their own comfort for authority over other people's behavior. I have talked to men with actual weapons who are more tractable than certain young men who have never been told that the world does not organize itself around their preferences. I recognized Trent's variety immediately and completely. He was not dangerous. He was not mean in the deep sense of the word. He was simply a person who had never encountered a situation in which his preference was not treated as a binding social obligation by everyone in his vicinity. I said, "Son, the pool has 2 lanes. I am using one. The other is available." He said, "I don't want the other one. I want this one. I've been here all summer and that's my lane and I'd like you to get out of it." I said, "That's not going to happen." He said, "Excuse me." I said, "I arrived before you. I'm using this lane, and the pool rules don't establish exclusive lane reservations. If you'd like to use the pool, you are welcome to use the available lane." He stood up. He said, "Do you have any idea who I am?" I said, "You're Trent Colton. You live at 14 Ridgetop Drive." He seemed briefly surprised that I knew this. Then he said, "My mom is on the HOA board. She's the social committee chair." I said, "I'm aware of your mother's committee position." He said, "So maybe you want to think about being a little more cooperative before this becomes an issue." I said, "Trent, nothing about this situation is an issue. There's a lane available. I'd suggest using it." He said, "I'm going to make this an issue." I said, "You're welcome to do that." He took out his phone. He called someone. From the one-sided conversation I could follow while I resumed swimming, I did resume swimming because my lap count was not going to complete itself. He was calling his mother. I heard him say, "There's some guy in my lane, and he won't move, and can you call someone?" And the particular quality of a young man who has always had problems solved for him, reporting the specific problem he was currently having. I did my remaining 18 laps. Trent stood at the pool edge for a portion of this time and then sat in a lounge chair with the young woman, who appeared to be advising him, in the limited way she could advise him, to let it go. He did not let it go. He was on his phone for most of the time I was swimming. I finished my laps, got out of the pool, dried off, and was putting on my flip-flops when Diane Colton arrived at the pool gate. She was still in what appeared to be a morning robe. She had come quickly, and she had the expression of a woman who had been called with an urgent report and had responded to that urgency and was now assessing the situation to determine what required her management. She came through the gate and looked at Trent and then at me and said, "Is there a problem here?" Trent said he wouldn't get out of my lane. Diane looked at me with the expression of someone who had been told a narrative and was now meeting the subject of the narrative for the first time and was performing a rapid assessment. She said, "I'm Diane Colton. I'm on the HOA social committee." She said this with the specific weight of someone deploying a credential. I dried my face with my towel. I said, "Good morning, Diane." She said, "My son has been using that lane all summer and he says you refused to move." I said, "Your son asked me to leave a lane I was using before he arrived. The pool rules don't establish lane reservations. I declined to move." She said, "Well, it's a courtesy thing. If someone has an established routine," I said, "Diane, the pool is a shared community amenity available to all residents under the same rules. I was here first. I was mid-workout. There was an available lane. I suggested he use it." She said, "You could have been more cooperative." I said, "Cooperation doesn't mean yielding my spot in a shared public amenity to someone who arrived 40 minutes after I did because he believes his preference constitutes a reservation." She said, "I'd like to resolve this without involving the HOA board formally." I said, "There's nothing to resolve. The pool rules are clear." She said, "I'm going to need to know your name so I can discuss this with the board." I said, "My name is Douglas Hale." She wrote it down on her phone. She said, "And what do you do, Mr. Hale?" I said, "I'm the sheriff of Pershing County." The particular quality of silence that followed that statement was one I recognized. It was the silence of a rapid contextual revision, of a situation that had been framed one way being reframed at speed as additional information arrived. Diane's expression changed in the specific way that expressions change when a conversation that felt like it was going one direction is clearly going somewhere else. Trent, who had been watching from the lounge chair with the confidence of a person awaiting a favorable resolution, had the expression of a man who had just understood that the situation contained information he had not accounted for. I picked up my bag. I said, "Have a good morning." I walked out through the pool gate and drove home. HOA Karen's spoiled son ordered me out of my own pool, not knowing I'm the county sheriff. I want to be precise about what I did and did not do after I drove home from the pool that morning, because the distinction matters. I did not contact the HOA board. I did not call anyone. I did not send a letter or file a complaint or do anything that leveraged my professional position in the direction of a neighborhood swimming pool dispute. I went home, showered, had breakfast, and drove to my office, where 23,000 residents' worth of actual problems were waiting for my attention. A young man who believed a community pool lane belonged to him personally was not the kind of problem that required the sheriff of Pershing County's professional engagement. It was the kind of problem that had already resolved itself, in the way that most problems of this kind resolve themselves, which is through the natural operation of reality asserting itself over whatever fiction had been substituted for it. I did think about the situation in the intervals between actual work, with the mild interest I bring to social dynamics that illustrate something I believe to be generally true. What Trent had demonstrated at the pool was a complete theory of authority based entirely on proximity, familiarity, and repetition. He had used the lane, therefore the lane was his, therefore anyone else in the lane was in error. This theory works in situations where no one challenges it. It fails immediately when someone declines to recognize it. The challenge does not need to be aggressive or confrontational. It simply needs to be a sustained refusal to accept the fiction, which I had provided by swimming my remaining 18 laps without apology, which is not a dramatic act, but is the correct one. I went to the pool the following Monday morning at 6:45. I set my lane ropes in the left lane. I swam 30 laps. No one arrived during my swim. I dried off and went home. This was the complete event of that morning. The following Thursday, I arrived at 6:45. I was 6 laps in when Trent arrived at 7:20. He stood at the pool edge for a moment. I was mid-lap. I completed the lap, came to the wall and looked at him. He looked at me. He walked to the right lane without speaking, put his towel on the right lane hook, and got in the water. We swam in adjacent lanes for approximately 20 minutes before I finished and got out. Neither of us said anything during those 20 minutes. When I was gathering my things, he said, from the water, without looking at me, "My mother's not going to let this go." I said, "I imagine that's her prerogative." He said, "She's going to bring it to the board." I said, "That's available to her." I said good morning and walked out. Diane brought it to the board at the next regular meeting, which was the second Tuesday of July. I attended, as I attended most meetings. She had submitted a formal agenda item in advance. I had seen the agenda, titled Community Pool Lane Protocols, and she presented it with a prepared document that proposed establishing a lane reservation system that would allow residents to register specific lanes for regular early morning use, with reservations honored on a first registered basis. The proposal was 7 pages, which was thorough for a pool lane policy and which suggested she had been working on it for at least 2 weeks. The proposal was not entirely unreasonable in concept. A lane reservation system could serve a legitimate community purpose. What it was, in its specific details, was designed to formalize Trent's existing informal claim. The registration window she proposed was 14 days, which meant existing regular users could register immediately, and the right lane registration she had already, she noted in the proposal, informally documented in her own records. The system, as proposed, would have legitimized a retrospective reservation that her son had never made through any formal process. I said when the floor opened that I was happy to discuss a reservation system if the community found one useful, but that any such system would need to operate prospectively rather than retrospectively, meaning registrations would be accepted starting from a specific future date in the order they were received, with no recognition of informal prior use. I said the proposal, as written, would institutionalize an arrangement that had been established through use rather than through any community process. I said that a fair reservation system treated all residents equally from the same starting point. The board discussed it. The HOA's management representative, a woman named Karen Wolfe, said any reservation system would need to be operationally simple to administer and that retroactive documentation created an unmanageable record-keeping burden. The board president, a man named Stan Ferris, said he agreed with my prospective-only point and that fairness required all residents to have equal access to the reservation process from the same starting position. The vote on Diane's proposal was 3-2 against adoption, with Stan and 2 other members voting against and Diane and another member, her supporter on the committee, voting for. Diane said she wanted to note her objection to the vote outcome in the minutes. Stan said that was her right and it would be noted. I drove home. I had been to longer, more interesting meetings. What followed over the next several weeks was the gradual resolution of a situation that had run its course through a series of small recalibrations on Trent's part that I observed without commenting on. The second Thursday swim in adjacent lanes had been a form of recalibration. He had accepted the shared lane situation without acknowledging it verbally. The following week he arrived on Thursday and I was already in the left lane and he used the right lane again. The week after that he arrived and I was not at the pool. I had an early meeting that day and he used the left lane, which was his choice to make in my absence. The week after that I was there and he arrived and used the right lane. By mid-August, the routine had settled into something that was not friendship and was not conflict. It was the ordinary parallel use of a shared amenity by 2 people who had arrived at an understanding through a process neither had explicitly narrated. He used the right lane when I was there. I used the left lane. We occasionally said good morning and occasionally did not. The young woman who had been with him the day of the original incident had not reappeared, which was perhaps its own form of information about how the morning had been narrated afterward. Diane stopped attending HOA meetings in August. She had been a regular attender for 3 years, and her absence was noticed by people who track these things, which in a 52-home development is most people. I did not know whether her absence was related to the pool situation or to something else in her life entirely. I noted it without drawing conclusions. In September, she knocked on my front door. I opened it and she was there without the robe and without the urgent expression of a woman who had been called from her morning routine to manage a problem. She was dressed for the day in the manner of someone who had decided to have a specific conversation and had prepared for it. She said, "Douglas, do you have a few minutes?" I said I did. I invited her in, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she said what she had come to say. She said, "I owe you an apology." She said it directly, which I respected. She said she had known for 2 years that Trent's situation, by which she meant his general situation, not just the pool, was not resolving the way she had hoped it would, and that she had been compensating for this by making the world around him as accommodating as she could manage, which was not doing either of them any good. She said the pool morning had been, in retrospect, a smaller version of a larger thing she needed to address. She said she was sorry for how she had handled it and for bringing it to the board in the way she had. I said I appreciated her saying so and that I accepted the apology. I said I had not taken the situation personally because it had not been personal. It had been a predictable outcome of a set of established patterns, and I had simply declined to be the surface those patterns ran on, which was all anyone could really do in a situation like that. She smiled slightly at the way I phrased it, which was probably slightly more analytical than the occasion required, but she was a thoughtful woman and she took it in the spirit it was offered. She said, "You were very calm about it." I said that was my job most days. She said, "Even off the clock." I said especially off the clock, because the clock was what consumed the intensity and the things off the clock were where the calm needed to be available. She said before she left that Trent was starting a job in October, something in logistics management that a contact of a family friend had arranged. She said this without the specific anxious underlining that parents sometimes apply to their children's employment news, which suggested she had processed her investment in the outcome and was reporting the fact rather than seeking a reaction to it. I said that sounded like a good development. She said she thought so too. She went home. I saw Trent at the pool twice after that before the season closed in October. Both times were on Thursday mornings. Both times he was in the right lane. Both times we exchanged a minimal good morning and swam in our respective lanes and left without incident. The second time, as I was walking out and he was finishing his last few laps, I said, "Good luck with the new job." He stopped at the wall and looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read, which had something in it that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, but was somewhere in the vicinity of both. He said, "Thanks," I said. "Have a good season." I walked out. The pool closed October 15th. I swam my last laps of the season on a cool morning when the water was still warm from summer, and the air had the quality that October air in the Virginia mountains has when the leaves are turning and the light is low and gold. I counted my 30 laps with the focused attention I bring every morning and stood at the wall for a moment at the end before getting out, looking at the water the way I look at things that matter to me, not with attachment exactly, but with appreciation for what they are and gratitude that they are available. Then I got out, dried off, and drove to the office. The badge was on the console, where I always keep it. I picked it up at the county line the way I do every morning and put it in my breast pocket, which is where it rides for the duration of the workday, which carries its own weight and its own demands, and its own version of authority that is nothing like a young man's voice at the edge of a swimming pool claiming a lane that does not belong to him. Real authority does not announce itself. Real authority shows up on time, does the work, and is recognized for what it is by people who know what they are looking at. Everyone else finds out eventually. That morning in June, Trent Colton found out at the sentence where I said my name and my title, and the conversation ended there, not because I had done anything dramatic, but because the information was sufficient, and the information was always going to be sufficient, and the only question had been when it was going to be shared. I shared it when it was relevant, not before, not louder than necessary, just clearly, just once, at the moment that made it matter. That is, I have found, usually enough. Thumbnail text, asterisk. He demanded my lane. I told him my name.